Hi there. I'm here today to talk about the power of stories and how they affect our relationships with others. So, if you watched my live feed last week, you will have seen that I talked about stories and how they affect us. And I was thinking about the way we can identify whether or not we're telling ourselves stories by the feelings that we have. So if we're telling ourselves a story about ourselves that is a fairly negative story, we will begin to feel quite bad about ourselves, and that's an indication that we're telling ourselves a story. I also sort of talked about the editorial viewpoint that we use in our story, and what's the editorial viewpoint? Who's editing the story? And quite often, the story can be edited by somebody who was fairly influential in our life and perhaps didn't really exert a very helpful, positive influence in our lives. And so, therefore, we tell ourselves negative stories. And finally, I asked you to consider whether or not the stories were helpful, and perhaps if a story isn't helpful, it's time to let it go. One of the things I talked about last week was the time when my children dropped a plate of spaghetti on the ground. I'm thinking about the story that was about. I could have been telling myself a story that my children were lazy and careless, and that's why they dropped the spaghetti. In actual fact, at that point in my life, I was able to say to myself, my children are children. They're still growing and developing. They're still learning. And that enabled me, when they dropped the plate of spaghetti, to be quite kind to them about it, because I was telling myself the story that children are growing up and they make mistakes, and that enabled me to be quite sort of kind about it. And so, the story that I was telling myself about them had an influence on what happened in that particular occasion. And so, what are the stories that we tell ourselves about other people? That's an example of how I sort of reframed the story that I could tell. But quite often, if we're telling ourselves a negative story about ourselves, that can flow into telling ourselves negative stories about other people. And particularly with our children, if we think we're not good enough, quite often because our children are our children, we think possibly they aren't good enough either. And we can tell ourselves that perhaps we're living in a dangerous world, we're living in a very competitive world, that it's really difficult for children to do well in the world today. And that makes us quite worried and anxious maybe about their education and how hard they're working. And that can make us sort of quite critical of them. And if we start telling ourselves a story that our children aren't very clever or work very hard, that can lead to all sorts of angst for us and for our children if we start, sort of nagging them and repeating the sort of negative stories that we're thinking to ourselves. And so that's sort of one influence that negative stories can have. I'm using children as an example because that's one that's sort of quite real to me. Now, the other thing that we can happen is we can tell ourselves positive stories about other people, and we can compare ourselves to those positive stories. And I think this is particularly true with social media. So we'll look at Facebook or Instagram, and we'll start looking at the photos of other people having really happy times. They seem to be out all the time. They seem to be surrounded by friends. They're eating wonderful food. They're on holiday. And as we're sort of feeling tired as we're getting up in the morning, and we're just sort of feeling, start of another day. We look at these amazing things that other people are doing, and that makes us feel bad because we're comparing ourselves to them. And the problem with comparisons, is that we rarely, if we tend to think badly about ourselves, we always look for how other people are excelling. We find the best that they're doing and compare it to the worst we're doing because that's what we feel worried about. So an example would be if we sort of really didn't feel we were very good at a particular activity, of course we compare ourselves to the person who's very good at that activity. And so, we're just sort of comparing their best with our worst, and it makes us feel terrible. So what I'd sort of suggest is just to notice if you're comparing yourself to people. And again, the way to notice it is to notice the feelings. What are you feeling? If you're going around with your head in a cloud, it's very likely that it might be to do with a story that you're telling yourself or a comparison that you're making with somebody else. And quite often in my own life, I've found when I've sort of been walking around with a bit of a cloud over my head, is I can actually pinpoint the moment at which I started feeling like that. And it quite often started off with something like a comparison with someone else. So the really sort of helpful thing, I think, to remember is have a look at our feelings, see what they're telling us. Are they telling us that we're telling ourselves a story that's making us feel bad? And again, like I said last week, is that story helpful? And if it's not helpful, then perhaps it's time to let go of it, and to sort of move to a place where, we're just us and we're human, and it's okay to be like that. So that's my live feed for today, and thank you so much for watching. Okay, bye.